There is a sound every farmer knows before he knows its name. It comes the moment your hand closes around a handle you haven't touched since last October, and the metal meets your palm wrong, gritty and dull, where it should be smooth and cold, and the smell reaches you half a second later. That specific iron gone bad smell. And you don't need to look, because your hand already delivered the verdict. The rust got in, and now you are going to pay for it, in time or in money. And on a working farm in the middle of the American 20th century, you had neither one to spare. The farmers who worked this land between the 1930s and the 1970s built a system of knowledge around that problem so exact, so layered and so battle-tested that professional conservators in museums still use versions of it today. They didn't acquire it in classrooms, they acquired it the way all knowledge worth having gets acquired on a farm, through consequence. Through a plough blade that cracked under spring load because rust had been eating into the metal since November. Through a hayfork tine that snapped clean during August cutting, because nobody had wiped it down in October, and now the hay was on the ground, and the weather was turning, and the arithmetic of the loss was simple and brutal. Through the Depression, which arrived in farm country like a slow flood, and taught an entire generation the same lesson, with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. What you let rust destroy, you cannot afford to replace. This is the story of how they stopped it. And it runs straight and unbroken through the life of a man named Eldon Marsh, who farmed 80 acres of clay and bottomland in Boone County, Missouri, and who understood iron the way some men understand horses or weather, not as a subject to be studied, but as a living obligation that followed him from the shed to the field and back again every single day of his working life. Eldon was born in 1911, second son on a wheat and hog operation. His father, Curtis, had broken out of raw ground sometime around 1900. By the time Eldon was old enough to be useful in the shed, the farm ran on 12 draft horses, a collection of iron-wheeled implements that groaned and clanked across the fields every spring, and the specific unforgiving discipline that comes from having no money and no margin and absolutely no tolerance for preventable loss. Curtis Marsh had a saying he repeated until it settled into his son's bones like something structural. A rusty tool is a lazy man's tool, not a judgment about character, a statement of consequence. Rust slows the work. A rusted blade doesn't cut clean. A rusted bolt seizes in the casting and costs you half a morning in planting season. And a half morning in planting season is a debt that compounds straight through to harvest. Curtis had inherited his rust knowledge from his own father, who had worked iron in the era before manufactured steel was common on American farms, when every implement came from a local blacksmith and was treated accordingly. What passed down to Eldon was not a single trick, but a complete layered system, and it was built on one truth that Curtis delivered to his son one afternoon when Eldon was 9 years old, standing in the shed doorway with a rusted hoe head turning in his hands. "Iron wants to go back to dirt," his father said. "That's the whole of it. Iron wants to return to what it was before somebody dug it out of the ground. Every day on this farm, your job is to stop it from doing that. Keep the air and the water away from the surface and it stays iron. Let them in and it goes back to dirt. That's not an opinion, that's what iron does." Eldon was 14 when Curtis handed him a rusted cultivator shovel and told him to fix it. This was not a gentle introduction. A hired hand named Willis, who had departed the Marsh Farm's employment in December under circumstances Eldon was not fully informed of, had left the shovel out through a wet November. The surface was pocked and flaking, orange-red where the rust had gone deep, a grey oxide bloom covering everything else. It looked like something pulled from a stream bed. Eldon's first instinct was to paint over it, and Curtis looked at that idea with the expression of a man watching someone propose to fix a broken axle with prayer. "You can't seal rust in," his father said. "You put a coating over rust, the rust continues underneath it. So it eats the metal from below while the coating holds, and you stand there believing you solved something. You have to get the rust completely off first, down to clean iron, every bit of it. Then you protect what's left." The removal started with a wire brush and a worn bastard file and a piece of sandstone from the creek. And it started with Eldon on his knees on the shed floor with the shovel wedged between his boots. The rust dust worked into his nose and throat and left a metallic taste that lingered for hours. His grip cramped. He wanted to stop. Curtis walked by periodically, crouched without comment, ran his thumb across a section Eldon had worked, and the gesture alone communicated everything. Not yet. Keep going, you haven't found iron yet. What you're feeling for is texture, Curtis told him. Clean iron is smooth and cold. Rust, even light rust you can't see, feels like fine grit sandpaper under the pad of your thumb. Run your thumb across and you'll know. You just have to pay attention instead of looking for permission to stop. After the mechanical work came the vinegar bath, and this was the moment Eldon's understanding of iron changed permanently. Vinegar was a kitchen material. It smelled like Rosella's canning operation in August. It had no logical business in a tool shed, except that Curtis kept a 5-gallon crock of white vinegar in the corner of the shed specifically for ironwork, had kept it there as long as Eldon could remember. And when the shovel went into that crock and sat overnight and came out the next morning, with the orange and grey completely gone, Eldon stood at the pump, rinsing the piece, and understood that his father had been operating on a level of practical knowledge that he was only now beginning to see the edges of. The chemistry is exact and it is not complicated. White vinegar is dilute acetic acid. When iron oxide contacts acetic acid, the reaction converts the oxide to iron acetate, which dissolves into solution and washes away. What remains is clean iron. Leave a piece in too long, and the acid begins attacking the bare metal, which is why you pull it after 8 to 24 hours and not when you happen to remember it 2 days later. But for the range of rust that found its way onto working farm tools, light surface oxide to moderate deep pitting, the soak removed what the wire brush had loosened and reached into pockets the file could not, and it did it without damaging the underlying metal in any way that mattered to the tool's function. Eldon pulled the shovel out, rinsed it, held it up in the morning light coming through the shed's east-facing window. The pitting was still there. You cannot fill craters with chemistry, but it was iron again. Dull grey and rough-textured, and unmistakably a tool, smelling of vinegar and cold metal, and the specific satisfaction of having understood a problem well enough to solve it correctly. Curtis inspected it, turned it once in his hands. Now you've got something worth protecting, he said, so protect it. The protection phase was where the old farmer's knowledge became genuinely extraordinary, because the materials they used were drawn almost entirely from what the farm already produced. The first and most important was lard, rendered hog fat from the November butchering that the Marsh family conducted every year as a matter of course. Not cooking grease, not machinery lubricant. Rendered lard with a specific fatty acid composition that happened to be well suited to clinging to iron surfaces across the temperature range of an unheated Missouri shed through a full winter. Curtis applied it with the tool slightly warm, set near the stove for a few minutes, not hot, just enough above room temperature that the fat flowed into microscopic surface pores instead of sitting on them. He worked it in with a rag in careful circular passes, every inch of metal covered, particular attention to the socket where the handle joined the blade, because moisture collected there first and rust always followed moisture. The coating was thin and nearly invisible, and it held through Missouri winters with the reliability of something tested against actual Missouri winters for 30 years. For tools in regular use, the hand planes, drawer knives, axes, and cutting tools that came off the wall every week throughout the working year, lard wasn't the right answer, because every use stripped some of it away, and a daily use tool ended up with no protection at all. For those, Curtis made a paste from beeswax and linseed oil. The farm kept bees, so wax was a farm product. Linseed oil came from the co-op in town. Curtis melted the wax over low heat, stirred in the oil at roughly 3 parts wax to 1 part oil, poured it into a shallow tin to set. What cooled was a flexible buff-colored paste that could be rubbed onto metal with a cloth and buffed to a thin sheen in 30 seconds per tool. The beeswax formed the physical barrier against moisture and oxygen. The linseed oil, a drying oil that polymerizes and hardens when it contacts air, penetrated the iron surface structure and created a secondary layer that bonded to the metal rather than merely resting on top of it. The combination held better than either material alone. On working tools, the paste went on every evening without exception. Wipe the metal clean, apply the paste, hang the tool back in its exact position. 30 seconds, non-negotiable. This was not a suggestion, it was the price of having a tool that worked when you needed it to work. For the large implement frames, the wheel hubs, the cultivator shanks, the iron that lived outdoors or in poorly ventilated sheds, and took the full weight of a Missouri year across all 4 seasons, Curtis used the most elegant solution in the entire system. The tractor produced used motor oil at every oil change, dark with carbon and combustion byproducts, already a waste product of an operation already running, costing nothing. Brushed onto implement frames and large iron surfaces before winter storage, it provided a barrier that farm families across the Midwest tested against real conditions year after year and kept using because it worked. Those frames came out of winter storage, season after season, with nothing worse than light surface dulling that wiped off in 5 minutes. Eldon carried all of it into his adult life. Then 1932 arrived and changed the weight of everything. The Depression had been working on Boone County for 2 years by then, but 1932 was the year it reached into the marsh operation specifically and took something that did not come back. Wheat prices had dropped to levels that made the farm's arithmetic almost impossible to close. The operating loan at the county bank got called 6 months early, and Curtis drove to Columbia and came back having sold 20 acres on the east side of the property to cover it. Eldon watched his father walk in from that trip and recognized something in the set of his shoulders that he had never seen there before and never wanted to see again. Equipment purchases were finished. What they had was what they had. What they had better last. That winter, Eldon rebuilt the shed's organization with the focused energy of a man who has finally understood the exact shape of what he is afraid of. Dedicated hooks for every tool, specific positions, specific order, from the tools he reached for every morning to the specialized pieces he used twice a season, the cleaning materials, rags, lard tin, wax oil paste, wire brushes, hung directly beside the shed door, not across the building, not in a cabinet, right there in your path. So the last thing between you and the kitchen was 30 seconds of attention to whatever you'd used that day. He was 21 years old, and the fear had found its correct expression, which was precision. The first real test came in February of 1933. Eldon had been running the disc harrow on the south field whenever the weather broke, short sessions between freezes, and one evening he came in late and went directly to the kitchen. He was cold and exhausted, and Rosella had made cornbread, and there was heat coming from the stove, and the shed could wait until morning. He did the shed in the morning. The disc blades had been in contact with wet clay soil, and the temperature had dropped overnight, and the surface moisture had begun to work. It was barely the start of anything, a faint haziness on the metal, light enough that most men would have wiped it off and considered it handled. But Eldon stood in the shed doorway looking at those disc blades and felt something move through him that was colder than the February air outside. He spent 45 minutes on what should have been a 5-minute job. He went to breakfast without speaking about it, and then told Rosella at supper that evening, because that was how things worked between them, and she looked at him for a moment with the expression of a farm wife who understands exactly what is actually being communicated. It never happened again. Not once. Not in 35 more years of farming. The spring of 1934 is the one that defined the rest of Eldon's life in the shed, though he didn't know that when the morning started. He was running the corn cultivator on the south field, third pass, April light still low and flat across the ground, when the shank he had been watching for 2 years finally gave way. He had seen the deep pitting. He had treated the surface every season and told himself the underlying metal was still sound, because the cost of admitting otherwise was real and immediate, and the cost of being wrong was theoretical and somewhere in the future. The shank cracked at its shoulder, exactly at the deepest section of the pitting, on a pass where the soil offered just enough resistance to find the weakness he had been excusing for 2 planting seasons. He stood in the cornfield with the broken piece in his hand and the tractor idling, and the morning light coming across the ground, and he did the arithmetic that farm people do in moments of damage, the arithmetic of time and money and consequence. The blacksmith in Centralia. Half a day gone at minimum, the repair cost, the corn ground falling behind a schedule with no slack in it. And underneath all of that, heavier than any of the practical figures, a simpler fact that he could not argue with because he was standing in a field holding the evidence in his own hand. He had known. He had looked at that shank every spring and chosen the interpretation that cost him nothing today. And today the bill had arrived at a time and place of the bill's choosing and not his. He got to the blacksmith by mid-morning. The forge-welded repair came out stronger than the original at that section. That is the nature of a good forge weld on quality iron, the repaired area often denser than what surrounded it. He was back in the corn ground by mid-afternoon, but that evening he went through the shed with the drop light he had strung from the overhead beam, a bare 40-watt bulb on a long cord, and he removed every cultivator shank from its position and examined each one at close range. He ran his thumb across every surface the way his father had taught him. He looked into every pocket of pitting with the kind of attention that is only available to a man who has spent a morning paying for the cost of not paying attention. 2 more shanks went on the repair list. He took them to Centralia the following week, before they chose their own moment. What that morning taught him could not be reduced to a maintenance checklist. It was a deeper lesson about the nature of honest assessment, about the difference between looking at a problem and seeing it, about the specific human tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence in whichever direction costs less today. He had done that. He had done it knowingly, for 2 springs in a row, and the shank had absorbed 2 springs of the decision before presenting the result. A farm does not argue with you. It simply waits and then shows you what your choices produced. He did not make that category of choice again. The county extension agent who visited the Marsh farm that summer, a serious and methodical man named Hargrove out of the University of Missouri, spent most of his time on soil management, which was where the federal program's focus lay given the condition of topsoil across the region. But he walked through the shed at the end of the visit, the way extension agents always did, because a man's shed told you nearly as much about his operation as his fields, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the organization for a long moment without speaking. He asked about the vinegar crock. Eldon explained it. Mechanical removal first to break and lift the oxide layer, acid bath to convert and dissolve what the abrasive left behind, appropriate protective coating based on the tool's intended use and storage conditions, lard for stored pieces, beeswax oil paste for working tools, used motor oil on implement frames. Hargrove wrote it down. He said he had encountered similar practices on 3 other farms in the county and was trying to trace how the knowledge moved between operations. Eldon told him the honest answer. His father had taught him, and his father's father had taught his father, and at some point the chain went back past anyone living who could say where it started. It came from the work. You farm iron every day on an operation that cannot replace what breaks, and you learn what iron requires or you spend money you don't have. The knowledge didn't come from anywhere in particular. It came from the consequence of not having it. Hargrove wrote something else in his notebook and said he suspected that was true of most real agricultural knowledge. Eldon thought about that after the man left and decided he was probably right. The farm steadied through the latter half of the 30s, not prosperous, steady. Rosella ran the kitchen with the same systematic care that Eldon ran the shed, because cast iron cookware and cast iron farm implements answer to the same enemy, and the women who managed farm households in that era knew it as well as anyone. She dried her skillets and Dutch ovens on the residual heat of the stove after washing them, applied a thin coat of lard while the iron was still warm, stored stacked pieces with brown paper between them to prevent the surfaces from abrading each other. Every cast iron piece in that kitchen was treated as the irreplaceable object it was, because in 1936 in Boone County, Missouri, that was precisely what it was. The shed and the kitchen mirrored each other across the farmyard, the same principles, the same materials, the same daily discipline expressed in 2 different buildings. Eldon found something settled in that consistency. It was not a coincidence. It was the correct understanding of what metal required, applied uniformly to every piece of metal on the property, regardless of which building it lived in. Ray grew up in that shed exactly the way Eldon had grown up in it. Wire brush before file, vinegar before coating, thumb test before any assessment of a surface's readiness. By 12, he ran his own seasonal inspection passes without prompting, going around in the same order every year, methodical and unhurried, coming to Eldon only when he found something that required a decision beyond his experience. Eldon watched him and felt the knowledge moving forward the way it was supposed to move, intact and functional. The next set of hands already learning what the hands before them had learned. Ray left for Korea in 1950. He came back in 52, thinner and quieter in ways that took a few years to fully ease, and on his second day home, he walked into the shed and ran his thumb along the surface of the first tool on its hook, an old broad hoe that had been in the shed since before Eldon was born, and looked at what his thumb told him and nodded once. It was Curtis Marsh's gesture, passed through Eldon to Ray across 30 years, and a war and the full distance between a farm in Missouri and a ridge in Korea. It meant sound. Someone paid attention while I was gone. Eldon had, every evening, every tool. The routine does not pause for a war any more than the rust does. The 1950s brought commercial products into the rural hardware market that hadn't existed before, and Eldon engaged with them with the same pragmatic precision he applied to everything else. WD-40 reached the hardware store in Columbia sometime in the early part of the decade, its name standing for Water Displacement 40th Formula, originally developed for aerospace applications. A neighbor showed Eldon what it did to a bolt that had been seized solid since the mid-40s, and he was genuinely impressed. The penetrating action was real and fast and better than anything in the shed for that specific problem. But Eldon watched the treated surface over the following days and saw what the neighbor had not been watching for. The protection thinned as the lighter components evaporated, and by the end of the week, the surface felt nearly bare under his thumb. He understood from that observation precisely what the product was and what it was not. Excellent at displacing moisture and freeing seized components. That was real. A long-term protective coating for stored tools. That was not what it was, because it did not stay. For storage protection, the lard and the paste did what they had always done, and the new product did not change that. He bought a can and kept it in the shed for its correct purpose. He kept the lard and the paste beside the door for theirs. New products earned their place by demonstrating function, not by arriving with a reputation. Around the same time, he had started using petroleum jelly, the same material in medicine cabinets across the country, on threaded fasteners and the seams and folds of sheet metal implement parts. An extension service bulletin from the late 40s had mentioned it, and Eldon had tested it and confirmed that it worked. Dense enough to stay in place, thin enough to apply precisely, impervious to moisture, and available from the hardware store or the Sears catalog in whatever quantity you needed. He added it to the routine without announcement. It worked. That was the criterion. It had always been the only criterion. His grandson Dennis was born in 56, and by the time the boy was tall enough to see the workbench without standing on anything, he had inherited the curiosity that good shed work tends to produce in children who grow up around it. The desire to understand not just what to do, but why it works, what is actually happening in the metal and in the chemistry when the old methods are applied. He asked better questions than Ray had at the same age, and Eldon answered them with the same directness his father had used with him, without simplifying and without condescending, because the knowledge deserved to be passed forward whole. The afternoon that stayed with both of them for the rest of their lives came in the fall of 1967. Dennis was 11. He had been working along the fence line at the far corner of the south field and had found something in the tall grass near a rotted post. A pocket knife, just the blade and the liner with the handle scales long gone, reduced to what appeared to be solid rust. Orange-brown from tip to pivot, pitted across every surface, apparently beyond any reasonable recovery. He carried it to his grandfather, the way boys carry found things to the person they trust most to know what to do with them. Eldon took it and turned it in his hands with the assessment that had become entirely automatic after 50 years of looking at iron. He examined the blade profile under the rust. He checked for cracks through the steel. He tested the pivot's resistance with his thumb. The geometry was intact. The steel had not cracked through. The pivot was seized, but the structure was whole. It was iron that had been allowed to progress far along the road back to dirt, and that was a condition with a known remedy, the same remedy it had always been. He explained this to Dennis not as instruction, but as diagnosis, thinking through the problem out loud the way he had done his whole life when a younger person was standing close enough to hear. What you're looking at is iron oxide, he said. The iron reacted with oxygen and moisture over a long time, probably years, and formed a compound that doesn't function as metal anymore. Our job is to remove that compound and recover what's underneath, and then make sure the reaction doesn't start again. It's the same problem it's always been on this farm. The knife is smaller than a cultivator shank. The principle is identical. It has always been identical. He set the knife in a glass jar, poured vinegar from the crock until the blade was covered, placed the jar on the workbench where the morning light would find it. He told Dennis to leave it alone for 24 hours. Dennis wanted to check it at noon. Eldon told him that the acetic acid reaction proceeded at its own pace, and Dennis's impatience was not a variable it responded to. They checked it together the following morning. The vinegar had gone dark and cloudy with dissolved iron acetate. Eldon lifted the knife out and rinsed it under the pump and held it out to Dennis without speaking. The boy took it and looked at it. Grey and rough-textured and dull, but metal clean iron, the orange gone completely. And Eldon handed him the steel wool without a word. He watched Dennis work the surface, corrected his grip twice, pointed without speaking to the deeper pitting near the pivot that needed more passes than the flat of the blade. Dennis worked it until the test came back right. That specific smooth coldness under the thumb that meant oxide no longer held. That meant the iron was clean. Eldon handed him a small rag and the tin of mineral oil. Dennis rubbed it in with the circular motion he had watched his grandfather use on larger tools since before he was tall enough to reach the workbench without help. When he held the knife up in the light coming through the open shed door, the metal caught it, the way clean metal catches light, flat and direct and certain, without the granular warmth that rust throws back at you. The pitting remained in the deeper areas. The handle scales were still gone, but it was a knife protected and functional, pulled back from a process that had been working on it for years. That's what you've done, Eldon told him. You stopped the iron from going back to dirt. But here's what you need to hold on to. The iron doesn't know you fixed it. It has no memory of this morning. The moment that oil breaks down and the air and the moisture reach the surface again, the reaction picks up from exactly where it left off. You haven't solved this permanently. You've won today, you have to win tomorrow. And every day after that, for as long as you want to keep that knife working. Dennis looked at the knife and then at his grandfather. So you just keep doing it, he said, every day. Same as everything else on a farm, Eldon said. That's the whole secret. There is no other secret. Dennis kept that knife for the rest of his life. He touched up the mineral oil several times a year, freed the pivot with a fine file, eventually fitted new handle scales. He shaped himself from a piece of walnut off a storm-felled tree on the property. When people asked about it, he said it was something his grandfather had taught him to bring back from the edge of being lost. What his grandfather had actually taught him was simpler and larger than any single knife. That iron never fully dies as long as someone is willing to pay attention to it every day without exception. And that the willingness to pay that attention without exception is not a talent or a gift, but a decision that you make once and then honor every morning for the rest of your working life. Every method Eldon Marsh used from the day his father handed him a rusted cultivator shovel until the day his knees ended his farming life. The vinegar bath, the lard coating, the beeswax oil paste, the used motor oil on implement frames, the petroleum jelly on threads and seams. The linseed oil worked into wooden handles to stabilize them against the socket wear that abraded protective coatings from metal. Every one of these methods is as effective today as it was in 1933. The chemistry has not changed. The iron has not changed. Acetic acid still converts iron oxide to soluble iron acetate and washes it away. Rendered lard and beeswax oil paste still form moisture and oxygen barriers that hold through a cold shed winter. Linseed oil still penetrates and stabilizes wood grain. Petroleum jelly still excludes moisture from threads and seams with the same density it always had. If you have a rusted tool in your barn or your garage or your shop right now, something that came out of an estate sale, or a barn clean-out, or a box of old equipment that nobody knew what to do with, you know exactly what to do with it. Mechanical removal first, wire brush and file and fine abrasive down to clean metal, vinegar to dissolve what the abrasive left behind. 8 to 24 hours, rinse and dry completely. the right coating for the tool's use, wax oil paste for working tools, lard or light machine oil for long-term storage, petroleum jelly on every threaded fastener and every seam, and then the daily attention. 30 seconds, consistent. So without exception, that is the difference between a tool that lasts another 50 years and one that goes back to dirt in the first wet fall you give it. The old farmers earned this knowledge across depression winters and wartime shortages and the long, grinding decades of farming without margin, and they passed it forward one shed at a time, one afternoon with a wire brush and a vinegar crock at a time, to hands that would carry it forward again. It has reached you now. Use it every day. That is all it has ever asked. Thank you so much for watching today. If this story brought something back, a grandfather's shed, the smell of linseed oil on a winter afternoon, a tool you watched someone maintain with that quiet daily care that you understood even as a child meant something, we want to hear about it in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, hit the like button because it genuinely helps more people find content like this, and share this video with anyone in your life who still cares about the way things were built to last and kept to last and passed on to last a little longer. There is more where this came from, and we are glad you are here for it. This video is inspired by real historical events and real farming practices documented across rural America during the 1930s through the 1970s. It does not intend to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Eldon Marsh is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who maintained their tools and their operations through exactly these conditions. Depression winters, wartime shortages, and the long post-war decades of change during the era portrayed. Every method described in this video is historically accurate and technically sound.